All right. Hey everyone, and welcome to another live stream. Today we're going to do some discussion on accessible forms and exactly what that looks like. And so, unlike some of my previous streams, I won't be designing anything in Figma. However, I intended the stream to merely demonstrate some of the essentials when it comes to creating forms, and it's a short presentation. I do intend on making a significantly longer video at some time in the future. However, that will probably be posted on YouTube. I'm working on something there as well, so I'll be the first to know whenever that transpires. So to begin with, let's take a look at the one of three slides I have in this pseudo slide deck here in Figma. So as far as forms are concerned, we need to know what we're talking about first and foremost. So forms, as I'm sure you may or may not have seen numerous times, are ways in which users can fill out information that gets submitted to a company or a service of some sort. You may have frequently, you might frequently do online shopping, and that's where you would encounter forms. For example, if you're purchasing something at Amazon and you're going through the checkout process, that'll be done as a form, and so you'll input information such as shipping address or billing address if they're different, credit card information, name, things like that. And all that information gets submitted to the company, in this case Amazon, through a form. And there's certain technology on the back end and parts in the front end as well that facilitate that. However, that's again a topic for a different discussion, and this is going to be focusing purely on the UX and the UI portion of forms. And so just to briefly go over exactly what goes into a form, I have the main ingredients here on the left, and I may have missed one or two, and I did leave one or two off intentionally because these are the components of a form that you're going to encounter most often, and the ones you're likely to design for most often. And so to begin with, we have fields. And fields are comprised of two subcomponents, the label and the control. Another word for the control is the input. And you might also see, in fact, you're almost always going to see buttons. Usually the default action of a button is submit. They can be told again on the on the code side of things to have different actions. However, login, for example, over here, that's a form. It's a form of submitting information, even though the text here may say something that's not submit. Login is essentially the same thing. We'll also encounter checkboxes and radio buttons, and I have examples of both over here in their checked state. And so the top one, this is the checkbox, and the one below is the radio button. And checkboxes and radio buttons are used for different, you'll find them in different sections. So for example, to use the example of online shopping, you would encounter a radio button when you're making a choice between payment methods, for example. In one section, we'll consider the payment section. In one section, only one radio button can be like clicked or selected or tapped at any one point. And so for the payment, let's say you had two credit cards on file. Well, you would only want to pay with one, and of course Amazon wouldn't want to have to, or any e-retailer, e-commerce outfit wouldn't want to have to deal with refunding money because it costs them money. They're only going to allow you to select one form of payment. And so instances where you need to choose between one of several options and you can only have one of those options selected is when you would encounter radio buttons. And checkboxes are when you can select multiple items or sometimes none at all. And we also see drop downs, and I have an example of that here on the right. The drop down typically has this icon is called a caret, and I believe that's what it's called. And you would you click anywhere in the box where you click the caret, and a additional information would appear, and then you could choose. For an example, on this image I found on Google Image Search, you would choose between options, and to continue with the e-commerce analogy, These might be sizes. For example, if you're choosing a size of a shirt, for example, you would have your different sizes here. And then we also have text area. And an example of a text area would be, I guess I sort of went with a e-commerce theme so far, but text area would be a place where you could, very frequently you'll see comments used, or you would see delivery instructions, for example, is common when you're purchasing things online. You might add comments in this field that would say something along the lines of, if no one is home, deliver to neighbor, or please place package in a certain area, something like that. Additional information that would go along with the order. And then, of course, I didn't point out the example explicitly, but we have fields, label, and control. The label, of course, over here, these two being together. The label is the username, and the control/input is the box where the actual or the user would type the information. In this case, a username. And so these are, excuse me, the ingredients. This is what goes into creating a form. Most of the time, you won't always see all of them, but you're guaranteed to see one of them because that's what forms are made of. So let's talk a bit more, and this is the main focus of this conversation, or of this stream, I should say, is labels and controls. And I put this slide deck together about 30 minutes ago, which is usually how I do things when I live stream, so it does not look as nice as it could be. However, I was able to cram all the relevant information in on this screen. So let's take we'll take a meandering path through all this. And we'll start with this portion in the middle here, and it says, is it easy to hear, see, interact with, and understand? These are questions that you're going to want to ask yourself when you are designing forms. So designing anything, really, but germane to this conversation, forms. And what this means specifically is when you take these questions into account, you are considering all the different users who may use your product, and to a lesser extent, the situational aspect, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment, of the user, where they are, and how might that affect their ability to use your form. And we'll start with the examples over here on the left, and I put them in sort of a don't category as opposed to the do category here on the right. And so it's been popular for a while now on web and mobile applications and I'm thinking this is a design choice that was created to save space or possibly look sleek, or just create a really slick looking UI. Very often you'll see, and this would be the control, this would be the input, this rectangle I drew here in Figma, where you'll have placeholder text instead of a label. And you can compare and contrast this control with this control that has a label over here. So we have placeholder text here, no placeholder text here, but a label instead. And so the issue with placeholder text, and this is sort of a continuation or a part 2 of a stream that I did three weeks ago, maybe something like that, possibly a month, where I discussed what I'd been learning so far about input fields or forms in general. And since then, I've read some just fantastic articles, and I'm about halfway through just an amazing book on best practices for inclusive form creation. And I thought, since some of the information that I sort of opined on last time turned out not to be true, and I said that when I learn more, when I read more, I will update this. This is that update. So at the time, I said that I was on the fence about placeholder text, and having knowing what I know now, having read what I read, I am pretty much firmly against placeholder text. And I'll go over some of the reasons why. First and foremost, we'll consider the first question. Is it easy to hear? So that specifically refers to, in this scenario, screen readers. Some of your users may have visual impairments that disallow them just to use the screen the way you and I may use the screen, where we can just easily look and determine where everything is and what everything does. And the issue is, and I wasn't able to find the most up-to-date information on this, but I think that, and assuming is bad, but I think in this scenario, assuming allows you to err on the side of caution. Some of the information I read, and again, this may not be completely up to date at this point. Popular screen readers such as JAWS and NVDA, they do not read placeholder text, and there's new screen reader software coming out all the time, and that could have been updated. However, because there are so many flavors of screen readers, you might want to, again, err on the side of caution and just assume that a screen reader, or assume that all screen readers are not going to read placeholder text. And so this is in this scenario, that's a very poor replacement. The placeholder text here wouldn't tell that user who uses a screen reader, it wouldn't tell them anything. All they might hear, and this would depend on screen reader software, of course, is like input field, or depending on how it's labeled, they might not hear anything at all. And so that's why it pays to know your accessibility for front end and UI UX as well. So you can have your CSS, HTML, and JavaScript people add the correct tags when they are creating these fields. And another thing to consider as far as placeholder text is concerned, is it easy to see? Well, let's consider not necessarily users who are using screen readers, but users who may have visual impairments, not necessarily who use screen readers, but who can't differentiate that well between certain shades of gray, for example. And almost always, as we see in this example here, the placeholder text is, compared to the label text that would have been there originally, the placeholder text is, if not gray, then it's a lighter version of the primary text color. And so in this scenario, where everything is pretty much monochromatic, just black and white, or I guess off black and off white to be specific, I chose a gray here that would logically go along with the color palette I've chosen. However, this might be completely illegible, not readable at all to someone with a visual impairment. And so that strikes off C on the list here of, is it easy to? And let's consider this third one here, interact with. Now this one may not be as clear as the first two. Interact with would have to do with considering your users who might have mobility issues in their hands. And that could be, not to, the reason doesn't matter, of course, that's completely irrelevant, but that could be that could be a permanent damage to the hand, or that could be temporary. That is to say, a user may have broken their, if they're right-handed, they may have broken their right wrist recently. And so using a mouse or a trackpad on a laptop, or touching or tapping on a phone might be considerably more difficult than it would be otherwise. And so, and I put everything in a frame. I framed these up in Figma to prove a point here. And so interact with ties directly into the idea of the tap target. And now what a tap target is the area that may be visible, or it may be invisible, of a selectable element in your UI. And you may have noticed in sort of an invisible form of that if you've accidentally tapped what you think is too far away from an icon on your phone, but it registers that tap as being connected to the icon that you wanted to touch. All of that together is the tap target, and the tap target very frequently will exceed the limits of what you actually see. And so an example of that, let's examine the tap targets for, and I won't use exact numbers on this because I did not I did this in a weird, the resolution I went with on this slide deck is a little bit off, so I'm not going to use exact figures because they won't mean anything. However, if I remember correctly, the heuristic for tap targets is, I think, like 44 by 44 points or pixels or whatever unit of measurement you're working with, and of course that'll depend on your device. iOS devices, all their new models have Retina displays, and so you'll need to be very diligent when you are creating your iconography and your controls, your inputs, and anything that's going to be a tappable or selectable object. You'll need to make sure that you're hitting your minimum, which is, generally speaking, 44 by 44. If it exceeds that, fine, but that's going to be your minimum. So far that seems to be the heuristic to remember. And so as we see, if we compare on the left, this tap target is smaller than this tap target over here that has a label on it, almost by a factor of 2. And of course, I won't get into the weeds on this, but as far as your HTML and your CSS concerned, when you're coding, when you're creating markup to create a field like this, your label is part of the form, and all of this would be one tap target. And so this makes it easier to, if you just tap username, you're going to select the field, and you can be in typing or tapping in information. And that's not only easier for users who may have an issue with motor skills, but it's just easier for everybody. And so, why not? Why not include that? I'm very much trying to sell you on the value of labels here. And so, by virtue of having a label, which for other reasons that I previously discussed, you'll also come away with a larger tap target. And the last, is it easy to bullet point question here is it easy to understand? And that is an issue, that's another issue regarding placeholder text. I guess another, I could have subtitled this, Why Placeholder Text is Bad. As it says down here, placeholder text is not a real value. That is to say, it's, if you were to not put it, for example, this password field, if you were pressed submit, or if you click submit on whatever form this was on, this isn't actual, the placeholder text isn't a value. You're going to get an error state. You'll have an error on the page, and it'll refresh and tell you about it. So the placeholder text is not a real value, but it could be confused for one. And that especially could be the case if the text was, or if the font color was as dark or had the same style as your primary text, then it very much could be confused for an actual value. And this question here, is it easy to understand? When you are thinking about this question, you may be considering what your design, how it affects those who may have cognitive impairments. And so seeing what could be confused as a value in a control in an input field may create the illusion that it's already been filled out. And so the user might click or tap submit and then get an error message, and then that would cause confusion as to why that happened, when indeed it looked like there was something already in the field. And there are excuse me, other issues with placeholder text as well, and one of them I did my best to illustrate here. If you are and passwords are, you often see this with password input fields, password controls. So password in each company, each service you sign up for, whether it be eBay or a forum, they're going to require a password with some sort of constraints, some sort of stipulation. A character minimum, you may need to include special characters, one uppercase, one number, one numeral, whatever the case may be. It can differ frequently between companies. And so you will, as a designer, you'll want to account for that. Of course, you'll need to put that information somewhere, because of course the last thing you want to do is assume that the user is going, you don't want them to find out by having the user make a mistake and then have to do everything again, because that's incredibly frustrating. And at that point, they just might leave your service and not consider using your product. So you want to make things as smooth and as easy as possible. I know, UX 101. And so the issue with putting this information here in putting the password necessities, the requirements, as placeholder text is it's probably not going to. I can't think of a way that you could have either so few requirements or have a text size so small that it would actually appear here. And as you can see here, who knows how long this was going to go on. It says must contain 8 charac, and so a lot more, many more restraints or many more requirements can be listed that we'll never see. And again, we won't be privy to them until we make an error, and hopefully there's a smart, friendly, helpful error message that'll inform us. But the point is to never have the user, as best you can, it's not avoidable 100% of the time. The point is to never have the user encounter an error message. And so this is worthless for another reason as well. And so let's say that somehow you were able to fit all of your password requirements as a placeholder text. Okay, what happens when the user clicks in the input, clicks in the control to start typing? Well, the placeholder text goes away. And now they're having to remember what it said before, and if they want to see it again, they might click out to have the text reappear, or it might not reappear depending on browser or how that's set up in the back end or the front end. And so you're adding a lot of significant amount of cognitive load. It could be significant depending on user, of course. And you don't want to force them to remember when they could just look and see. And so now that I've banged on about placeholder text for quite a while, let's look at the do column. Now, this first example, which is I have a control here, an input field, and it has a label. And so, of course, as I explained earlier, not only does this increase our tap target, we don't have to worry about, again, as I just said, if the compared to this control over here, if we were to click here, the placeholder text username would disappear and be ready for some inputs. We wouldn't have that problem. Username, the label isn't going anywhere, so it's persistent. We know what's here, and so it makes it easier. It cuts down on the cognitive load of having to remember what it's for. And so there's not a whole lot to say about this first example that I haven't said previously. And so let's move on to considering a better version of the password input field than the one we have here on the left. So the one on the right here has, we now have the, I guess, old-timey requirement for the password here. It says must contain 8 characters. And so it's no longer in the placeholder text. It's always going to be visible. And because the hint text is part of the label, it just has a line break and smaller text, your tap target got even larger. And so that, there's a bonus right there as well. And I think I've covered some of these, but I'll go over them again. So screen readers can read labels. And so as opposed to this, which, who knows how the screen reader is going to interpret that, the screen reader will say username input field, or however that software works. They all work slightly differently. And it will also be able to read not only the label for password, the screen reader will also read the requirements, must contain 8 characters. And I've covered larger tap target when you have hint text as part of the label. And there's also no confusion regarding the value here. And I want to, in the value, I worded that poorly, but the value would be exactly what the requirements are. That should be, let's try that again. Whoop. Requirements. And so this is clear for everyone. For everyone, this makes much more sense. And I'll cover the lock icon in a second. I debated whether or not to include that, but I thought it would be wise because it wouldn't take too long to discuss why that's a good idea. And a good question outside of the is it easy to questions is a question you'll want to keep in mind, especially when you're designing for accessibility, is the experience comparable. And I could explain that, but I wanted to use this as a segue to a website that I've been using a lot lately that contains just some fantastic information about some inclusive design in general. And so I'll go ahead and Alt-Tab over to a tab I have open in my browser, which is inclusivedesignprinciples.org. And they have a very simple website, which it's very on brand, and I appreciate what they've done here. And of course, it's available in several languages, and they have some principles here. Not too many. They keep it nice and short. Looks to be 7 of them. And the first principle is provide comparable experience. And as it said here in italics, ensure your interface provides a comparable experience for all people, or for all, so people can accomplish tasks in a way that suits their needs without undermining the quality of the content. And it has some just fantastic examples here. Content alternatives, ergonomic features such as closed captions, and then notifications, which sort of ties into the smart-friendly, understandable error messages that I mentioned previously. But scrolling back up a bit here, under the subhead here, we're going to focus on can accomplish tasks in a way that suits their needs. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to Alt-Tab back over, or Command-Tab back over to Figma. And so I would say, and it is my argument, that having a password input or password portion of the form that looks like this, compared to this one here in the do column, I would say that these aren't compatible, or comparable, I should say. That is to say, if you are reliant on screen reader technology or any other assistive technology, you're going to have a significantly more challenging time interacting or trying to fill out a form that has placeholder text rather than the requirements of the password written out plainly here. And so for a number of reasons, it's including that one being first and foremost, these are not comparable interactions. These are not going to be comparable experiences. And so you risk not only alienating, but losing that client depending on which jurisdiction you're in, and the size of the company and the point of the website, all these variables in place. This could be an equal access issue. This could at some point fall under the category of law. And again, depending on what sort of outfit you were working on, this if your screen reading, if your users who rely on screen readers, if they're unable to log in or complete a process or steps or checkout or anything that involves forms of this sort, then essentially you are making inaccessible, an inaccessible web form or inaccessible web app, and so that would be an equal access issue, and that could land you in some very hot water. And so that's something to bear in mind. And I would add at this point, when I'm probably getting closer to being finished here, I would add at this point that it seems like, and I haven't been doing this for too long, of course, but I have been developing for the web for a long time, off and on for about 20 years. And I will say that when I started doing web development back in like 99, 2000, accessibility was rarely heard of. Only the biggest companies would even really think about it. And it isn't that the technology wasn't in place. That's not to say that it was great, because it wasn't, and our technology now is a lot better. Still not great. It's getting there. It's a lot closer to great than it was previously. It's that it just wasn't considered. That is to say, accessibility for web technologies and apps didn't really exist at the time. We called them programs back then, and no one had a mobile phone really, but a few people did. If it was ever thought about, it was far and away an afterthought. And it seems like these days, thankfully, and it's it's still early days and it's very rocky, but it seems these days there's much more of an emphasis on accessibility. And I don't know what the and it'll probably go through a number of buzzwordy titles before it lands on something. But I think inclusive design is currently maybe the nomenclature, the jargon that we're using now, and which I'm not a fan of speech like that. However, it's semantically accurate. You do want your design to be as inclusive in the literal definition of the word as possible, and we're coming a long way, or we've come a long way. We have a long ways to go, and the point of this rambling, the point of this rambling is there still seems to be, and it's still somewhat prominent, and it would depend on the UX maturity of the company or the outfit that you work for. There still seems to be this attitude that accessibility is something you do or something you consider after the fact, after the product's done, or after a launch, or after. When in fact, it would save time, it would save money, which are, I guess time is money's a function of time, I suppose. It would save effort and just all your designers a lot of heartache if we just learned to design accessible interfaces, accessible forms in the scenario from the beginning. It shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be at the end. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but it shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be baked in to the very foundation of design. And on the one hand, it's pleasing to see that some boot camps, some courses are at sometimes it's small victories that you can take a lot of solace in. Sometimes I feel like the fact that they mention accessibility at all is a big win. Certainly, more could be done, and indeed, entire semesters could be taught on just certain aspects of accessibility. However, the point of this is I would highly advise you as a product designer, as a UX UI professional, to consider accessibility first. Start with it first. And so that way you don't have to retrofit entire component systems for your projects, and you don't have to tackle you could spend months creating a UI and then find out that parts of it aren't accessible, and so you would spend months fixing that. Whereas if you had done the research at the very beginning, it may have taken might have taken you a little bit longer, but significantly less longer than having to fix it after the fact, and of course money and all the effort that would go into that. And so, just start with it. Start with accessibility. Get that in your head that accessibility comes first and foremost. The later, the further it's put off, the more issues it's going to create for the project and the team. And so that is my diatribe about accessibility. Go away, OS 10. And so we'll move on to the third and significantly less populated slide I have here. And this has to do a little bit with the order that you put certain elements in when you're considering your forms here. And so, and I didn't have a better place to put this, so I wrote law of proximity and eye tracking tests. So consider the and this sort of uses a similar pattern to what we saw on the last slide before I started talking forever. Consider this pattern here. So it does say, or it does have a hint, must contain 8 characters. However, it would be outside of the label markup or the label code. It's below the control, and the issue with that is. I don't remember the gentleman's name or the team's name, but there were some eye tracking tests done where users they looked at a series of forms, and on each form a few things are in different order, and they found that users reacted most positively to, and they understood the point of forms that have components that look like this, where you have your hint directly under the label, and not under the control. This tested far better than this did right here. And depending on your design purview, I guess, or your opinions about design, this may look better to you. However, again, this pattern right here is the one you'll want to use, and I don't really have too much more to say about that. And this is another pattern, and thankfully we don't see this one too often anymore. But we have the password, we have the label off to the side, to the left of the control, the input. And the reason that this doesn't work out is that might look fine on, well, okay, first and foremost, it goes against what was, it sort of violates the law of proximity, because this almost looks like two separate entities, like not connected to each other. And also, this pattern did not fare well in the eye tracking test, and I'll try to find a link for that and paste that to the appropriate chats where you know where to find me. The hugest issue with this is, while it may look fine on desktop, this is unlikely to look great on mobile. And it's either going to squish your text, make the control small, or something's going to get moved around and it's going to look funny, or be completely inaccessible. And so usability is going to suffer no matter what. And so I would definitely argue against, I would definitely say avoid using this pattern here. And I didn't have a great end for this stream. This is pretty much the end of the stream. But I did find a quote that I thought was very, very apropos to the topic of this video. And this comes from Adam Silver in page 37 of the, and I do intend on doing a video review of this book at some point, but it's the book Form Design Patterns, page 37, Adam Silver, where he says, I can't emphasize this enough. So often, the basic experience is the best and most performant one. And they're much like, a lot of what Adam Silver writes is very plain and to the point. And as I've hopefully successfully demonstrated here, by using, we'll go back to slide 2, by using what we might consider plain or basic form patterns, like what we see over here in the do column for the username and the password. This is, they may be, it's a sliding scale between, really hip and edgy UI and extreme, or not extreme, just like usability in general. And this is going to work better. These two on the right, they're going to work better almost all of the time. And of course, there's an argument of, well, it's against our brand guidelines or our design system to have labels on our inputs, or we like, our design system stipulates that we use placeholder text or no hint text or anything like that. And I would say to strongly reconsider that, because that's, this is very much an accessibility issue and it's a usability issue overall. And really and truly, as was pointed out in a different section in that book, so I guess on sort of a higher level, no one wants to use forms. Forms are awful, just generally speaking. No one wants to sign up for anything. And when we do have to sign up for something, and I'm using the we because I'm sort of assuming people feel this way, but we don't want to sign up for anything. And I can point to some proof of that as being the ability to purchase anonymously. So, you could, I think you can do this on Amazon. You can go to an e-commerce website, you can go to a retailer online, and you can purchase without logging in. And if they're smart, they might ask you to log in when it's finished so as to not interrupt you. But people don't want to log in. They don't want to sign in. They don't want to register for anything. I certainly don't. Just give me the content. And you don't need my email. We do not need to bring passwords into this transaction. You give me the content, I'll be on my way. And so when we absolutely do have to use these things, that's frustrating. When we do have to use them, when we do have to create input fields, we need to make sure that they are as simple as possible and as accessible as possible for all users, because it's a hassle to begin with, but it's a hassle that can be minimized. And so that is about it for this live stream. I went on a little bit longer than I expected to. However, that's getting super frustrating. There we go. Hopefully I was able to impart a little bit of knowledge about at least the basics, the super basics of form accessibility. And of course, if you have any questions regarding that, you know where I am as far as the chat applications are concerned. And of course, feel free to subscribe to me on Twitch and sign up for notifications. That way you'll get an email whenever I go live. And yeah, let's see here, I'll be streaming this Thursday at 7:30 CST. So I hope to see you there. Have a wonderful night.